The lamps along the palace corridor smelled faintly of burned oil and wet limestone, but beneath that thin scent there was a metallic tang that would not be named. At the center of the east wing, a girl no older than 16 sat cross-legged on a velvet cushion, fingers stained with coal and a tremor in her jaw as attendants smoothed a silk veil over her hair. They called her princess. In the hush of the inner rooms, she answered only to fear. He wore a crown of gold and linen outside, and inside the private chambers, his voice had the cold precision of a judge. If we are to understand how the ruler who appeared invincible turned his bloodline into a corridor of grief, we must follow the clues that were hidden under carpets and buried in ledgers. If you want more investigations into power and silence, like and subscribe. What we will uncover in the documents and the bones changes the story of a dynasty and the cost of imperial brilliance. His daughters were not merely footnotes, they were ledger entries that became names at the bottom of graves. It is the year 480 BCE, in the city that lay beneath the cypress and the sun, that we begin. Xerxes was not born fully formed, he was taught. He learned to walk under banners and to answer to the word emperor before he learned to answer to the word father. His tutors spoke of kingship as stewardship of the gods and as absolute command over bodies and lands. In his childhood courtyard, the clatter of bronze, the smell of cedar chips, and the sting of corrective ropes fused lessons of obedience and divinity. Amestris, his mother, was exacting. Hystaspes, his uncle, recited genealogies until the syllables hardened into law. Even as a boy, his eyes lingered on the way a retainer flinched when remembered wrongs were read aloud, and he stored that flinch like a promise. As a young man, he returned from campaigns not only with standards and tributes, but with a conviction that mercy was weakness. The memory of a winter siege, of bread that tasted of peat and blood, of soldiers weeping beside frozen horses, taught him that the world was a ledger that demanded balancing. Those lessons shaped both his politics and his intimacies. By the time his daughters were old enough to be given names and court lists, the idea that prestige required sacrifice had been braided into his speech. Where childhood had left wonder, his formation placed calculation. This backstory explains the arc that follows. A ruler who kept the empire whole at a monumental cost, and who learned to make human lives into instruments of policy. By the time he took the throne in the public square, processions had become his theater. The city smelled of saffron and dust, horns made the air ache, and banners snapped like the skin of drums. In front of the palace, crowds pressed for tickets. A glimpse, and the emperor passed in a chariot of ivory, his eyes shielded by a veil of gems. He granted lands, he dismantled rivals, he led campaigns that expanded borders and expanded his myth. Kurosh, the chief scribe, kept meticulous entries of gifts and arrests, of honors and confiscations. Mardonius led armies that returned with columns of captives. Artabanus advised midnight edicts sent by courier. In these public victories, the first institutional violences showed themselves as policy. Men were moved, property reallocated, and women were placed in households to cement alliances. The tribunal became language for punishment, and punishment became a way to display order. Inside a council room one evening, the smoke of incense pooled like fog over a carved table. Xerxes addressed his advisors. Xerxes, the provinces send complaints, governors speak of lawlessness, strength must be seen. Artabanus, public spectacle will serve, a procession of confiscations, public apologies. Mardonius, if we show mercy, the nobles will whisper, they will think us weak. Hystaspes, authority requires clarity, let law take its course. Amestris, what of the households, the families that support our bonds? Kurosh, records show dissent concentrated in border satrapies, a show of discipline will settle them. Xerxes, discipline must be absolute, no exceptions. Artabanus, then let the palace set the standard, a punishment that reminds. Mardonius,
We take one example and place it where all can see. Hystaspes. Names are prepared. The public must not see mercy. Xerxes. Arrange it. Make sure the ledger is clean. Kurosh. I will note this as decree of the crown. The room heard metal, the rustle of silk, the faint scrape of a reed pen. The scene smelled of resin, of roasted figs, of concern. Sunlight glued itself to the gilded cornices, while in the courtyard the chuff of horses continued. That exchange marks the moment when statecraft began to justify personal intrusion. Victory hardened into routine. Campaign reports arrived like waves, each one bringing tribute and a fresh inventory of human assets. The palace grew disciplined in its record-keeping, with a caged quiet in the inner wings where lists were made and names disappeared from public life. Evadne, a senior attendant, kept the daughters' schedules. Zari and Lysette moved like clockwork, their days mapped by fragrant baths and recitations, but the map had margins where the unknown crept in. The harem was a place of perfumed curtains and strict timetables, where silk brushed skin and candles leaked wax that smelled of pine. There were always the small sounds that betrayed tension. A ladle dropped in the kitchen, a throat cleared down a corridor, a shutter slapped closed. These micro-notes of palace life formed the texture of what would follow. The emperor returned from campaign with a different cadence. He spoke less in the great halls and more in the sleeping rooms, asking for reports in half-sentences, testing loyalties with glance and hunger. He devised rituals that blended public piety and private control. The daughters were slowly entangled. In these rituals, their education included languages and etiquette, but also a daily litany of obligations to the throne. They learned to thread crowns and to fold letters with the care of priests. Over time, policies once discussed as general measures settled into intimate practices. A curfew here, a reassignment there, a selection under the pretense of honor. The palace began to hum with a low, constant surveillance. This descent produced two moments of tension that changed lives. The first came when Evadne discovered a ledger entry that referred to a set of girls described as reserve of alliance. She felt bile rise, the taste of iron in her mouth as ink blurred under her fingers. She remembered cradling the youngest on a night of thunder, the child's breath a small drum against Evadne's palm. The moral calculus pressed upon her. To obey was to survive, to speak was to die. For 3 nights she made the decision to conceal one name within the folds of a laundry list. The act was small, tactile, and monstrous in shadow. It bought a week of safety and birthed 1,000 consequences. The second tension arrived when Kurosh found a secret memorandum that ordered transfers of custody of the daughters to military hands. The paper crackled, the wax seal smelled of myrrh, and his hands shook as he read words that turned family into logistics. He faced a choice between the clarity of loyalty and the risk of conscience. He decided to speak in whispers to Artabanus. The palace operated like an organism now, with departments that handled marriage, tribute, and custody. The harem functioned as an administrative department, not merely a collection of rooms. There were protocols for introductions, for the recording of births, for the gift of dowries. Those protocols became instruments to adjust alliances and to punish perceived slippage. Zari and Lysette were moved along schedules that read like edicts. Morning lessons, midday audiences, evening purification. Names were stamped in ledgers by Kurosh, approval signed by Hystaspes, and sometimes countersigned with a simple knot by a mistress. The complicity of many made the machinery possible. Mardonius ensured enforcement, Artabanus drafted the memos, Evadne managed movements, Kurosh logged the events, Hystaspes mediated disputes. Each person listed had a function and a voice, but the sum of their actions formed a net that caught the daughters. Witnesses later spoke in fragments. A gardener named Ressa remembered the sound of a carriage wheel that never returned. A seamstress named Zara kept a scrap of purple that smelled of incense. Evadne, once she could, whispered confessions to travelers. These testimonies functioned as evidence, unreliable in isolation but devastating together. They described rituals gone wrong, a feast that ended in a quiet removal, and orders passed by a hand that had been baptized in victory. The administrative orders read like neutral prose, but the content was corrosive. Transfers, wards, custody under military oversight. The logistics language allowed those involved to speak of procedure rather than sorrow. It is here that the difference between empire and family blurred and became a tool for control. The conspiracy that ended this cycle began as a moral crack among those who served closest to the king. In a cellar beneath the armory, lamps guttering and smell of iron and mold, Artabanus leaned toward Mardonius, Korash, and Hystaspes. "We cannot keep what we have done." Mardonius: "If the court turns, all will be lost." Hystaspes: "He will name heirs and bind the realm to practices we cannot justify." Korash: "The ledgers carry stains, the people whisper." Evadne: "My hands have folded too many veils. I cannot watch the young vanish." Artabanus: "Then we end the source, remove the instrument of fear." Mardonius: "Blood will answer blood. The soldiers will listen to me." Hystaspes: "We need certainty. We need proof of his intent." Korash: "I can forge an order to move custody beyond his reach." Evadne: "And I can distract the attendants the night it happens." Mardonius: "At dawn, by the eastern postern. He likes to stand at sunrise." Artabanus: "Choose words carefully. The act must be unavoidable." Hystaspes: "We will leave a testament that holds him accountable." Xerxes, asleep in his chambers, murmured in dreams of banners and of a voice that called him King of Kings. The night smelled of vinegar and the cold metal of spears, while outside the city the sky cleaved into light. The night of action was tight with small details. Candles guttered, the taste of roasted barley hung in the air, and footsteps muffled by rugs sounded like distant animals. The conspirators moved with the practiced silence of people used to hiding truth. Inside the inner chamber, Xerxes rose to inspect a tapestry and found faces he had trusted shadowed by resolve. His last words were not a curse, but a question about the ledger. He said quietly, with a hand to the embroidered hem, "Who will remember the reasons?" His voice carried the flavor of regret. In the melee, the daughters were pulled from cushions and wrapped in cloth that still smelled of lavender. Evadne held them like a supplicant holding a relic. The final exchange was brief. Xerxes: "They are mine." Artabanus: "They belong to the realm." Xerxes: "Then take the realm." The rest was noise, a scrape of stone, a wet sound, the thud of a body hitting tapestry, and then the hollow weight of silence. The conspirators left a forged decree on the table and carried away the names into custody, framed as exile. The public narrative would call it a transfer for the stability of state. Inside, the ledger told a bleaker story. After the event, the palace performed its accustomed acts of cleaning and denial. Publicly, there was a procession and ritual declarations about stability and the will of the gods. Privately, the palace carried out erasures. A month after the night, the court announced that certain members of the royal household had been relocated for their safety. The families of the missing were paid stipends. In 3 months, Amestris granted a muffled interview to a traveling chronicler claiming that the changes were made for dynastic clarity. In 6 months, the official ledgers showed a clean account, names reassigned, debts settled, no public scandals. Yet rumors persisted in the bazaars, in whispered verse, and in the memory of attendants. It is the work of archaeologists and archivists that later pulled this story from the shadows. Years after the palaces cooled, a shallow grave at the edge of a necropolis yielded fragments. Pieces of silk, a shattered comb, a bracelet stamped with the empire's emblem, and a small bone assemblage. The bones were disarticulated, their positions disturbed by time and early looters, but osteological analysis detected perimortem cut marks and indications of constrained movement.
Kurosh scribed a confession on a scrap of lead that eventually surfaced in a collector's trunk, and in that cramped handwriting he admitted to forging orders and concealing names. An excavation report described the grave soil as reeking of long-dissolved incense and as layered with brick fragments from hastily demolished outbuildings. The forensic team used radiocarbon calibrations to place the deposit within a narrow window that matched the time of the disappearance. A historian named Lydia combined archive and excavation and found intersection: the ledger entries, Kurosh's lead note, the silks, and the burial. The convergence of material and text closed the gap between rumor and likely truth. The archaeological reveal did not produce tidy verdicts. Courts of later generations debated the chain of custody of evidence, questioned the motives of those who came forward, and argued about the line between political necessity and private atrocity. Museums hesitated to display the fragments because of the discomfort they raised. The necropolis yielded more: a small box of tokens belonging to one daughter, an amulet with inscriptions that suggested personal devotion, and a set of seals that matched administrative stations. Each object smelled faintly of the same things that had filled palace rooms: myrrh, cedar, and the slow rot of time. Publicly, official histories continued for years to gloss the episode as stabilizing reform, but scholars began to publish papers that juxtaposed the material evidence with court memoranda. The lead confession of Kurosh, thin and corroded, changed the conversation. It suggested that a state apparatus had been turned toward familial control, and that people inside the palace had chosen to confront that instrument at terrible cost. 1 month after the discovery, a small press published a translation of Kurosh's note and a photo of the silk fragment. The initial public reaction was disbelief, followed by a ripple of outrage in literary circles. 3 months later, a university symposium displayed a reconstruction of the procession and invited descendants of the servants into conversation about memory and restitution. 6 months after the scholarly revelations, the Ministry of Antiquities consented to a limited exhibition that included the fragments and an audio station playing testimonies. The exhibition room smelled of wax and paper, and visitors paused in silence before a case that held a nondescript comb and a tag that read simply, "Daughters of the Crown." The state provided a terse statement that acknowledged new evidence while urging careful interpretation. Civil groups called for formal recognition and for reparations to families of palace workers. The debate shifted from whether something terrible happened to what a society does when it discovers that terror wore the face of legitimacy. The moral consequences are not abstract. The daughters, reduced to entries and ledgers, remind us that institutions can convert intimacy into policy, and that legality can become a veil for violence. The bones and the lead note do not absolve every accomplice, nor do they offer uncomplicated closure. What they do is force a reckoning with how power organizes memory. If we choose to protect monuments of greatness without excavating the costs beneath them, we sustain an incomplete truth. Share this video so these stories do not remain hidden in cupboards and in quiet graves. Subscribe if you want investigations that pair documents with dust, and leave a comment about which artifact you think should be displayed in public, even if it makes us uneasy. Remember that history is made not only by crowns and triumphs, but by the small hands that were folded and the names that must be spoken. The true measure of a legacy is whether it can bear the light of scrutiny without unraveling the lives that held it together.